Oh, it is a crazy day. As you all know by now, Amazon workers in Staten Island, led by Christian Smalls, a friend of the show, regular of the show, they have won their union vote with their own union on top of it. Pretty incredible. So, very busy day and a great day to talk about a new economy. We are very excited today to have Erica Smiley on and Sarita Gupta. They are the authors of The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's good to be here, especially today.
Yeah. And thanks for
right.
I can't stop smiling.
Well, your name is perfect for that. So
yeah, right. I should have been a dentist, right?
I know. I always love like these lawyers, and you like they have these big ads, and their names like are like lawsuit or something. It's their last name. It's amazing.
Yeah.
Hey,
yeah.
My name's Nomiki, which means law in Greek, and I am not a lawyer, but I should have been one.
So you understand.
I do. So I guess let's just maybe we'll start off with the concept of your book, and if you guys want to talk about what happened in Staten Island, let's go for it.
Oh my God. Okay, Sarita, if it's cool with you, I'll just kick it off. So here we're in this moment, right? So our book is basically called the Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. And in it, we try to make several interventions. The first is to say that organizing and collective bargaining is actually one of the fundamental practices that will be a pathway to a healthy multiracial democracy. That is not just a political project like voting once a year, but that it's something where we need to involve the majority of people into decision making in their economic lives as well, including in their employment relationships. And the second piece is that we want to expand this practice to employment or economic relationships beyond employment, or at least to apply to employment as it looks today versus how it looked in 1935. As we know, like, I don't think Robert Wagner could have predicted Amazon in 1935, right? And so trying to apply the framework, I'm from North Carolina, and, you don't go door to door in my community and say, you have the right to elect a senator. You say you have the right to vote. And I think likewise today, and particularly given the ALU has proven, you aren't just saying you have the right to form a union, you're saying you should have the right to organize and collectively negotiate your conditions in the place where many Americans spend the most of their time, which is at work. And so that's the premise. And I guess the last thing I want to say, which feels maybe most important, particularly as we talk about the stuff that's happening today with the Amazon workers, right, is that Sarita and I argue, like, you can't do this without centering fights against white supremacy and patriarchy and gender discrimination, like that. It's not just a matter of doing what's morally right or being in alliance and an ally relationship with different movements, but that it's about recognizing the interests and the motivations of workers as whole people, and not centering those fights is a guarantee for our defeat. And so when you look at the work that the union in Staten Island did with Christian Smalls, right, which was activated after the Black Lives Matter movement kicked off, where you've got a company like putting its PR stuff out on Black Lives Matter, but then firing Black workers for asking for protective equipment during a pandemic, right? Like, or you look at the workers in Bessemer right now, where it's too close to call, right? In Alabama, it is too close to call, even though the company put in millions of dollars, right? That when you talk to the leaders in the plant in Bessemer, they say, we saw the murder of George Floyd, and we realized that this fight here in the plant, that was our Black Lives Matter movement. So this is a workers' movement. It is a movement for racial justice. Like, these are people who don't see those things as separate strategies. This is a total sea change moment for the labor movement in the country.
Sarita, do you want to chime in response?
Yeah, well, I would ditto everything Smiley has just said, and just point out how important this victory is today. I love that we're streaming the voting and the celebration that's happening, but this win at Amazon on Staten Island is really part of a much bigger movement that we see happening right now as workers across the country are organizing, whether it's at Starbucks, right, where there's already 9 stores that have unionized, and we see more every day that are growing, or the 600, the hundreds of workers at the digital workers at New York Times who recently organized into a union. I mean, this is part of a much bigger moment, and our book really tries to lift up that the importance of the book actually right now is that we're in the midst of a great awakening, right? People often talk about this moment as the great resignation. People aren't quitting, right? Their jobs and leaving the labor force. They're quitting their jobs and going to other jobs that will give them the kind of living wages and benefits and respect and dignity that they need, and agency, as we see through these unionizing efforts. And so what's really extraordinary about this moment is the fact that workers have recognized how important it is to collectively come together and actually make change in this way. And that's really the future we need.
It's interesting because The Future We Need, the title of your book, I immediately thought of these recent documentaries and docuseries and series on sort of the rise and fall of tech companies and tech leaders and people who've built sort of scams, or maybe they weren't, they just went too far. But all around, these are companies and people who sort of emerged around the late 2000s after the economy crashed. And I think about how much our world, whether it's Uber and Lyft and of course Amazon, how much of our world has shifted because in some cases, many cases, tech companies, these newer tech companies post the Great Recession, they found little loopholes to create companies so that they didn't have to operate within labor. Uber, I remember when they launched and they were in DC, they were calling the taxi cartel. And I never really, and I look back at that, I'm like, oh, they just wanted to escape labor and hoard all the money. But now they're forced to reckon with it. You can't run away. So is this a new form of labor organizing with these companies that thought they could get away with not paying labor?
Absolutely. This is the important thing to recognize. You're absolutely right that the way that work is structured has shifted, right? That transformation, along with, a lot of different trends and forces at play, right? So there's the tech-driven changes, the financialization of our economy, and really globalization has really made it much harder for workers to figure out how to organize in this moment. But what's so exciting about some of these recent victories is that workers are innovating. They're not waiting for the laws to change. They're being really clear that we deserve and need better conditions, better wages, regardless of what our classification is, by the way. We deserve this kind of dignity and respect, and we're going to come together and organize for that kind of change. And so, there's lots of great examples of where we see this happening, especially in the platform economy, where you're exactly right. There's been this avoidance of the traditional employment relationships. And I often love to lift up the example of domestic workers, domestic workers who have historic
I don't know if she froze on my end, but I'll finish what she was going to say. She was talking about domestic workers because they've historically not been seen as gig workers, right? When you think of gig workers, you think of Uber, you think of TaskRabbit, all these groups, but domestic workers are kind of the age-old gig workers, right? They've been gigging for individual employers for many, many centuries. And what's interesting is that recently a company called Handy, which is a platform that allows, helps us to assign domestic workers and nannies to particular jobs and tasks, kind of amalgamated the employment process for them. And so the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and particularly their gig workers, they organize Handy domestic workers as a part of the gig worker advocates group that they pulled together. And because they were excluded from the National Labor Relations Act, they were able to just negotiate a direct contract with Handy, just a private contract, like in court. I mean, is completely innovative. And it's like Sarita was saying, like we have platform workers from so many different sectors who are beginning to test different ways of negotiating directly, whether they're trying to say, okay, if you're going to say I'm not an employee, then create a framework for me to negotiate as an independent contractor, or you're saying this is misclassification. I'm an employee. I should be protected. Or in the case of the domestic workers, well, we'll just find a way outside of it to win. And so the thing that I want to like emphasize, and welcome back, Sarita. I just tried to pick up.
It was smoothless, man. That was like,
we got see, this is why we could write together. Right? We're just mind meld. We're mind meld. But like, but like the thing that I feel like Sarita was saying, and something that Sarita actually taught me just in the context of some of her recent work is the gig economy is not new. It's not a new shiny thing. They say it is, right? But I like to liken it to the digital camera, right? Taking pictures is not new. The digital camera, the platform is new. So with digital camera, we can take 200 pictures, choose our top 5, great. With the platforms, right, like we can now use these apps, get things up to scale in a way that we couldn't, say, in 1850. However, the practice is still the same, which is to try to essentially socialize the risk while privatizing the benefit of a particular sector and a set of workers. And that's basically what's happening within the gig economy.
That's fascinating. It's interesting you say this. This morning, I went on TaskRabbit this week, and I hired a guy to come in to mount my TV on my wall. I was like, you know what? I'm an adult. I'm going to do this finally.
Well done. Well done.
David, our producer, knows because I called him and I said, I might be late to start the show today because I'm talking to this guy.
We all have that moment.
So I was talking with him about, work he's doing at TaskRabbit. And, anytime in these situations, I always want to understand like what it's like to be on the other end. And I try because, it helps inform just the show in particular. And he said, I used to work in this other industry in security, and I was making a very dangerous situation as a public security person. And he was making $1,400 a month. And I'm like, what? With a child. And he said, now at TaskRabbit, I'm making, whatever, $6,000 a month, and I'm able to do it. I said, that's interesting though, but do you ever think about benefits? And do you ever think about, and he was like, I'm really struggling because I just don't have those options now. He's like, if I could find a job with, and we all understand that in the world that we're in. Yes. But I asked him, I said, so how do you set the rates, or how much does the company make? And, and then he told me how he sets his rate. And he said, I have a friend who charges this much money. So I charge a little bit less because we keep losing Sarita just for our audio listeners. She'll come back soon. We know.
We'll be back.
But I was fascinated because then I said to him, I said, when I go on TaskRabbit, there are people charging $200 an hour.
Right.
People charging $30 an hour. So I don't understand, for the same exact tasks and experiences. And it's mind boggling to me. It's that they can be all over the place like this. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but it really kind of messed with my mind today because I thought, this is an industry that is just, it's bonkers. It's
completely unregulated.
Yeah. Like, what?
Well, that's the thing, though. It's not an industry. This is the thing I feel like we have to clarify. And this is the thing that Sarita is really good at clarifying, is that it's not an industry. It is a practice. That's right. And it is a business practice. And the thing that's important is that it's a business practice that tries to deregulate certain things and certainly like decrease responsibility, or at least like fissure it, as David Weil would say, while still being able to reap the benefits of lots of people doing this from the platform. Yeah. And I think that here's another example of like an example as a business practice versus an industry. So like construction trades. We all know building construction trades is an industry. That's in itself, it's a sector. No one will come against that. But there are companies now within the painting industry in particular who are trying to create their own platform so that an industrial company, like an industrial paint job, like painting a big retail store or a bridge or a highway or whatever, that you can basically go on the platform like you could with TaskRabbit and find a painter to do that job, right? And like, so what are the implications? The implications are that, okay, you might get a cheaper price, maybe, who knows, like how they would set it up, but is it regulated? How can you prove that they're using paint that's been approved by the EPA? How do you prove that they've been through the appropriate certifications to do that job? Like all of these things, right? And that is not a change. It's not like it's a new industry. It is still paint. It is still industrial paint construction jobs, right? But like you're creating a business practice that undermines workers' ability to negotiate improved and better standards and benefits, like you were talking about with the person from TaskRabbit. But you also are undermining safety for all of us, right?
Exactly.
I guess you're deregulating a thing. Like, who knows who comes into your house and what remedy do you have if something happens?
I mean, I think about that as a woman. This morning I was just thinking, oh, I don't know who this person is who's coming in. Before he was lovely. He was a perfectly wonderful person, and
I'm
there's
sure
nothing.
He's great.
But it was more just as they're en route, I'm like, oh wait, I'm alone in my house right now. Like, what do I, And I know that sounds silly, but it is a reflection of the industry. It's not a reflection of the individual. It's a reflection of how this platform operates. We've heard the horrible stories that come out of Uber with Uber drivers and rape and kidnapping and holdups on both ends.
On both ends. That's what I'm going to say, because even the flip side, like what happens when a driver is attacked, right?
Which happens all the time. So this is happening. There are more and more unionization efforts. Hello, she's back. Hello, Sarita.
And we should all know for our listeners, Sarita is in residence at the University of Oregon for a couple of weeks for the purpose of this book. And so part of why her bandwidth is so low is she's calling in live, from the field per se.
Maybe there's a way with your camera. If you turn your camera off, maybe the audio will work better, and we're okay with that because we have audio here too.
Okay, so great,
wonderful.
Awesome.
You're just a circle now.
Yes, here we are.
So we were just talking about how because so many of these industries and platforms and tech companies or practices, as you said, they're unregulated. It's dangerous. Can be dangerous for both the individual who's working there, or the person on the receiving end.
That's right.
So in terms of just the aspect of how unionizing is, I mean, it's not that there are more strikes than ever, because this is, an interesting thing. After Striketober, people realize, no, actually, this is how often there are,
there actually are pretty consistent strikes. That's right.
Strikes consistently. It's just now reporters are reporting on it. But there are definitely more unionization efforts in these, different companies, whether it's Starbucks, who I'm surprised at this point hasn't even had, I'm surprised it took this long, frankly,
right.
Given, what we've been reading, but also other companies.
Right.
Is there a certain like formula that seems to work better than others?
Formula in terms of organizing, or formula?
Yeah, like a type of company. I mean, people are reading a lot about Starbucks, and it's, when you read about it, you're like, okay, well, there's a lot of young people at Starbucks. They're more prone to, not exclusively, but there are a lot of young people pushing it, are more prone to organizing, who may be a little bit more informed about the washing of we gave you free education. That's good enough. You know what I mean? Yeah. Or the little, so there's sort of like a perfect storm with Starbucks. How many employees work at each Starbucks? Are there other types of, trends that you've seen where labor organizing is more effective?
What's really interesting about your question, Nomiki, I have to say, so Lane Wyndham, who we cite in the book, right, gives a really detailed history of the rise of the union busting industry, right? And one of the things that they did was profile what types of employment facilities, what type of businesses were more likely to unionize. And particularly in the 70s, as more women were coming into the workforce, as more people of color were coming in after the Civil Rights Act, that they had a very clear metric that could measure, like, based on the number of women in the facility, the number of Black and brown people in the facility, based on the age demographics, they could tell you how likely you were as an employer to have to manage a union organizing campaign. Wow. And so what was interesting is Lane talks about it in the context of like the lost years between the 70s and 80s, when there were like massive labor actions particularly throughout the South, led in part by like the movements of women and people of color. And so the union busting industry developed in reaction to basically curb that, to find ways to exploit divisions between race, to exploit divisions between gender by making certain positions very gendered and undesirable, right? Like we've seen with the traditional women's work. And they did this as a way to prevent unions from coming in. And so I think that, to your question, yes, there is potentially a science behind it, but that our opposition has been so clear about that science, perhaps longer than we have as a movement, that they've put systems in place and laws in place to make it difficult, right, to organize across those divisions. And like one of the things I think, Nomiki, talking today, like one of the big topics that everyone is all up in arms about, right? Critical race theory, right. which everyone like misdefines, and no one even really knows they're talking about, except for like maybe 2% of the people. And but like the original theory came out of a labor fight of Black women at General Motors, right? Because they were the last hired, first fired. And, if you read Kimberly Crenshaw, who kind of is one of the founders of CRT, right? You find that like they were trying to have some remedy for the fact that they were losing their jobs, and yet Black men were still working in the plant, and so they couldn't represent Black people according to the courts, and white women were still working even though they were in gendered positions, so they couldn't represent women, so there was no way for them to get remedy, right? And so this is why, like in the book, when we talk about centering white supremacy and gender discrimination as key to winning, we do it because it's like it literally is like these are all worker fights. This is not just some separate academic discussion that's happening. These are fights of regular everyday people who are trying to claim justice. And so to your last point to your question, and then let's see if we can pull Sarita in on audio. But like the last thing is that I think that one of the things that we introduce in the book is this idea of a new map, and not looking at states simply by who they voted for president in the last election, but trying to look more about what their relationship is to 20th century platforms for democracy. And what we found in that is that the regions where they have long lost, if they ever had access, regions like the South and the Southwest, where the majority of Black people still live in the United States, where there are very heavy immigrant, particularly Mexican and Chicano populations in the U.S., that the appetite for organizing is perhaps more open and exciting and militant than it is in places where they recently have or have lost traditional means of organizing and collective bargaining and voting, right? So you look at the South. The South, actually, we could argue, is one of the most militant bases of workers for the labor movement. And it's actually on us to figure out how we're tapping into that and building power long term based off of that. So, it's not so much a question of sector by sector. I think certainly each workers in different sectors have different forms of power to throw into the fight to try to get to the table to negotiate with their employers. But that actually there's a new approach that we need to be thinking about in terms of reaching people who perhaps have been written off for the past couple of decades.
I just want to add in here that I also think I want to talk about women, and I want to talk about the economy and what were once considered sort of pink collar jobs are really now the fastest growing parts of our economy. And I think we're going to continue to see an upsurge of unionizing happening in these sectors, the care sector, the education sector. I mean, these are places, right now women are, 47% of union membership are women, right? And in these pink collar sort of sectors, they are heavily unionized. And so I think we're going to continue to see a trend, retail, I think we're just going to continue to see a trend in particular of women who are organizing for better conditions. And I think the pandemic really blew open the inequities in these profound ways. And especially the discussion that's been such a great and brewing conversation about the care economy is really forcing people, women across the economy, to say, it's true. Why don't I have paid family medical leave? Or why don't I have more bargaining power? Why don't I have the kind of flexibility I need or childcare supports? And it's really motivating and galvanizing women in a particular way in this moment that I think is really exciting.
And just to tie it back, I mean, you mentioned, Erica, the CRT fight right now. That's whatever this manufactured attacks are. It's also happening as there are school boards that are being recalled or have been recalled in California. CRT, school board, and then of course the mask fight with teachers. And I say that because we all know that teachers, it's a majority female workforce. They've been on the front lines during the pandemic. They're fighting all across the country. We've seen red state revolts. They're the largest donor to the Democratic Party, and they're the largest public sector employees. And so what I really love about your book, is that you flat out explain how this is a mechanism, anti-unionization is a mechanism of white supremacy and patriarchy. And so oh my God, I wish we could talk about this so much more. I'd love to have you back on. Let's just say that.
We got it, especially when Sarita's back on the East Coast, and that's like good bandwidth. We're here for it.
Absolutely. No, would love to continue this conversation. It is really exciting. And as you know, in our book, we do talk about that, but we also profile teachers and the leaders in West Virginia. So people should definitely go to, thefutureweneed.com and order a book. And let's continue this conversation.
Go check out thefutureweneed.com. Really, this was a great conversation. Very grateful to both of you for joining today. Sarita Gupta, who is in Oregon right now and the vice president of U.S. programs at the Ford Foundation. And of course, Erica Smiley, the executive director of Jobs with Justice, the authors of The Future We Need, Organizing for a Better Democracy in the 21st Century. Thank you so much for joining. Lovely conversation.
Awesome, Nomiki. Anytime. This was a joy. Total joy.
Thank you.
All right, guys. If this is the time, if you haven't already, make sure to join us on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show. Our patrons are what keep this show alive and well. It's how we can do it on the road when I'm filming other stuff. It's how I can, honestly, seriously, it's how I can take all this gear with me on the flight because it's expensive to check those bags. Our patrons make sure everything happens. Make sure we have David working his butt off. That is how our community grows, because we can't rely on the algorithms. We know that the algorithms in little places like YouTube and Twitch and all the different spots that we release our show to, you just never can predict. 1 month you're doing kick ass, the other month you're down a certain percentage. It is patrons who keep us going.